The city shimmered beneath a curtain of falling snow, every street wrapped in soft gold and silver from the holiday lights strung across lampposts and shop windows, yet Daniel Mercer barely noticed the beauty as he walked, shoulders hunched against the cold, boots crunching through slush that soaked through the cracks no matter how carefully he stepped, his breath coming out in tired clouds that felt heavier than the air itself, because exhaustion had settled into him not just as a feeling but as a permanent state of being, the kind that lives in the bones and makes even the smallest movement feel borrowed. Christmas music drifted faintly from a department store behind him, cheerful and distant, mocking in a way he didn't have the energy to resent, and he kept his eyes down, thinking of the empty apartment waiting for him, of the half-decorated tree his daughter had insisted on weeks ago and then stopped mentioning after she learned to stop asking questions that hurt, of the unpaid bills folded in his coat pocket like quiet threats, and of the way grief never fully left but learned how to wait patiently for moments like this, cold nights, bright lights, too much silence, when it could press its hand against his chest and remind him that he was still alone. He had almost reached the bus stop when he saw her, a small, bent figure near the alley behind a closed cafe, moving slowly, deliberately, as though each motion required careful negotiation with her body, and at first he thought she was just another shadow, another detail in a city full of people everyone had learned not to see. But then he noticed her hands, bare and red, lifting the lid of a trash bin with surprising care, as if she were opening something sacred rather than discarded, and something inside him stalled, an uncomfortable pause that made him slow down despite his instincts telling him not to, because he had learned painfully that stopping often meant getting pulled into stories you didn't have the strength to carry. The woman wore a long, threadbare coat that had once been dark blue but had faded into a color that matched the night, and a wool scarf wrapped neatly around her neck, frayed but clean. And there was nothing frantic or desperate about her movements, only patience and a quiet determination that felt out of place against the humiliation of the act itself. And as Daniel passed, she glanced up briefly, her eyes catching the light, clear and steady, not pleading, not ashamed. Just tired in a way he recognized immediately, and that was what undid him, because he had seen desperation before and had trained himself to harden against it, but dignity surviving where it had no reason to was harder to ignore. He took another step, then another, his mind already rehearsing excuses, telling himself that he had his own child to think of, that kindness was a luxury for people who weren't counting every dollar, that helping one stranger wouldn't fix a system that kept people like her invisible. But the snow kept falling, soft and relentless, settling into the lines of the street and the hollows of his thoughts, and he found himself remembering his mother's hands when she grew older, how they trembled slightly when she tried to hide it, how she used to say that pride was the last thing a person lost, and by the time Daniel realized he had stopped walking, his feet were already turning back toward the alley. The woman was kneeling now, carefully unfolding a paper bag she had retrieved, inspecting its contents with the seriousness of someone who had learned to be grateful without being hopeful, and Daniel stood a few feet away, the noise of passing traffic suddenly loud and distant at the same time, his voice catching awkwardly in his throat when he finally spoke. "Ma'am, are you okay?" And the question felt foolish the moment it left him, because nothing about the scene suggested okay, yet she looked up at him calmly, brushing snow from her knee, and said, "I'm managing," in a voice that carried no self-pity, only truth, and for a second neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with cold air and unspoken histories, and Daniel noticed details he couldn't unsee, the careful way her coat was buttoned, the way her hair, white and thin, was tucked neatly under a knit hat that had been mended more than once, the faint scent of lavender soap that somehow clung to her despite everything, and he felt a sharp, unwelcome pull in his chest, because this was not how he had imagined someone who searched for food in trash bins would be, and the woman, sensing his hesitation, straightened slightly and said, "You don't need to worry. I won't be here long," as if she were the one responsible for easing his discomfort, and that, more than anything, forced his hand, because suddenly he was no longer choosing whether to help a stranger but whether to honor the part of himself that still remembered what it meant to care. And as snow settled on their shoulders and the city continued to glow and rush past them without slowing down, Daniel felt the weight of his own life pressing hard against the fragile moment, the memory of nights when he had skipped dinner so his daughter could eat, the fear of one illness or one missed paycheck undoing everything he had fought to hold together, and he realized that walking away would be easy, survivable, understandable, but staying would change something, maybe not the world, maybe not even her situation in a way that lasted, but it would change him, and with that realization came a quiet, terrifying clarity, the kind that doesn't shout but settles deep and refuses to be ignored, and before he could talk himself out of it, before the cold or the fear or the habit of looking away reclaimed him, Daniel took a breath, stepped closer, and made the decision that would bind their fates together long after the snow melted and the holiday lights were taken down. Daniel did not announce his decision aloud, did not frame it as kindness or rescue, but simply asked if she would accept a warm meal, his voice low and careful as though the wrong word might fracture something fragile between them, and the woman, who told him her name was Margaret Bell, after a pause that felt heavy with consideration, hesitated just long enough for him to see pride wrestle with necessity before she nodded once, dignified even in surrender, and followed him to a small diner a block away where the windows were fogged with heat and the scent of coffee and soup wrapped around them like a forgotten memory. And as they sat across from each other in a vinyl booth worn smooth by years of anonymous conversations, Daniel noticed how Margaret held her spoon properly, how she wiped her mouth with a napkin folded just so, habits ingrained too deeply to be erased by circumstance, and he found himself oddly nervous, as though he were in the presence of someone whose approval mattered, even though she thanked him simply and ate slowly, carefully, as if mindful that this kindness might be temporary and should not be consumed too quickly. They spoke at first only in fragments, about the cold, about how busy the city felt this time of year, about nothing at all, but silence between them did not feel empty, only cautious, and Daniel realized that he was watching her the way one watches a reflection, seeing pieces of himself mirrored back in unexpected ways, the weariness, the restraint, the practiced self-containment that comes from learning not to rely on anyone. And when he finally mentioned his daughter, Emma, the words came out heavier than he intended, carrying years of exhaustion and love tangled together, and Margaret listened without interruption, her eyes softening, her hands wrapped around her mug as if warmth were something she needed to convince herself to accept, and she said quietly that children had a way of anchoring you to the world even when it tried to pull you under, a sentence spoken with such certainty that Daniel felt a sudden, aching curiosity about the life she must have lived to say it so simply. Over the next hour, time slowed into something gentle as they shared bread, soup, and stories that circled closer to truth without quite touching it, Daniel admitting that he worked nights cleaning offices after his daytime job fell through, that sleep came in pieces and guilt filled the gaps, that sometimes he felt like he was only pretending to be strong for Emma because she needed him to be, and Margaret responding not with advice but with understanding, telling him that pretending could carry you farther than you thought if love was the reason behind it. And as the diner emptied and the snow outside thickened, she began to speak of her own past in careful layers, describing a small house once filled with music, a husband who fixed things with patience and laughed too loudly, a career teaching literature that she adored because words had always felt like companions. And Daniel listened, stunned by the contrast between the woman before him and the life she described, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of a respected teacher hosting dinner parties with the reality of her searching trash bins for food. And when he asked, gently, apologetically, what had happened, Margaret did not answer right away, instead tracing the rim of her cup with one finger as memories rose uninvited, speaking then of illness that came quietly and demanded everything, of medical bills that multiplied faster than grief could keep up with, of a world that praised independence but punished vulnerability, and of children grown, busy, distant, who had promised help that arrived in words but not in action. And though she did not accuse them, the absence spoke loudly enough, echoing with Daniel's own fear of what would happen to Emma if he ever failed her, if he ever became someone the world decided to look past. As the night deepened, Daniel found himself offering small things without thinking: a ride, a blanket from his car, the reassurance that she could sit and rest as long as she needed, and each acceptance felt like a quiet victory against the instinct to refuse. Trust building not through grand gestures but through consistency, through the shared understanding that survival often required leaning when standing became impossible. And in the gentle hum of the diner's closing hour, Margaret finally said something that shifted the air between them, telling Daniel that she had once believed dignity was something no one could take from you, that it lived in how you treated others and yourself, but that she had learned it could be eroded slowly by loneliness, by being unseen, by becoming a burden in a world that had no patience for those who fell behind. And Daniel felt the truth of it land hard, because he saw how close he himself stood to that edge, how thin the line was between stability and disappearance, and it frightened him in a way he had not allowed himself to acknowledge. When he offered to take her somewhere warm for the night, a shelter, a motel, anywhere, Margaret met his eyes with a look that was both grateful and sorrowful and said she could not accept charity without honesty. And it was then, with a steadiness that made his chest tighten, that she revealed the truth she had been circling all evening, that she had not simply lost her home but had given it up years earlier, signing it away to help her son through a financial crisis that never truly resolved, trusting that family would remember her sacrifice when she needed them. And as the words settled, Daniel felt something inside him fracture and realign, because he saw not just her betrayal but his own reflection in it, the faith and love, the willingness to give until there was nothing left, the quiet hope that someone would catch you before you fell too far. And when Margaret added, almost as an afterthought, that she had once taught at the same school Daniel's wife attended, remembering her name, her kindness, the way she used to stay after class to talk about books, the world seemed to tilt, the shock of it stealing his breath, because in that moment Margaret was no longer a stranger but a thread woven through his own past, a living reminder that lives intersect in ways we never see until it is too late. And as he sat there, stunned, grief and recognition crashing together, Daniel realized that helping her was no longer an act of generosity but an act of reckoning, forcing him to confront how easily love could be lost, how quickly dignity could slip away, and how deeply connected their stories truly were. The days that followed unfolded with a fragile, uncertain rhythm, as if the kindness Daniel had offered Margaret existed on borrowed time, tolerated by the world only until it demanded payment, and that payment began to reveal itself almost immediately in the form of quiet judgments and louder obstacles that pressed in from every direction. Starting with the shelter worker who eyed Daniel with thinly veiled suspicion when he accompanied Margaret inside one evening, her tone polite but firm as she explained rules, limitations, waiting lists, and the reality that space was temporary and compassion carefully rationed, and Daniel felt a familiar burn of helplessness rise in his chest as he watched Margaret nod calmly, thanking the woman as if being reduced to a number were an inconvenience rather than a wound. And it was in moments like these, standing beside her while systems designed to help reminded them both of their smallness, that Daniel began to understand how exhausting survival truly was, not just for those who lacked resources but for those who tried to bridge the gap between what was right and what was possible. His own life, already stretched thin, began to strain further as he adjusted his schedule to check on Margaret, bringing her meals when he could, slipping her gloves he'd bought secondhand, and though she never asked for more than conversation and warmth, the cost of caring accumulated quietly, showing up in his dwindling bank balance, in the dark circles beneath his eyes, in the questions Emma began asking when he came home later than usual, her young voice careful but observant as she asked who he was helping and why he looked so tired, and Daniel struggled to explain without burdening her, telling her only that sometimes people needed someone to notice them, and she nodded with the serious acceptance of a child who understood more than she said. Yet the outside world was less gentle, his sister calling after noticing unfamiliar charges on his account and warning him sharply that he could not afford to play savior, that generosity was dangerous when you had a child depending on you, and her words cut deeper than he expected because they echoed his own fears, the relentless arithmetic of responsibility that measured every act of kindness against rent, food, and the future. And when his landlord announced a rent increase with practiced indifference, Daniel felt the ground beneath him shift, panic threading its way through his thoughts as he calculated and recalculated, realizing that one misstep could push him closer to the edge Margaret knew all too well. The pressure intensified when his night supervisor noticed his exhaustion and hinted that reliability mattered more than explanations, a warning wrapped in professional language that left Daniel lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling while guilt and resolve wrestled within him, because every practical voice told him to step back, to let institutions handle what he could not. Yet every time he considered pulling away, he saw Margaret's careful smile, the way she insisted on paying him back with stories and listening, the way she refused pity but accepted presence, and something inside him refused to retreat. Even as the consequences grew heavier, society's judgment surfaced in smaller, sharper moments too, in the sideways glances when he and Margaret shared a meal in public, in the whispered assumption that she must be his responsibility or his mistake, in the subtle distance people created when compassion complicated their comfort, and Daniel began to feel the weight of standing against a current that rewarded indifference and punished involvement, forcing him into a moral reckoning that questioned what it truly meant to protect someone when doing so threatened everything you were trying to protect for yourself. Margaret, perceptive as ever, sensed the toll this was taking on him and tried to pull away, insisting he had already done more than enough, her voice firm but eyes betraying fear. And one night she told him that love should never cost a child their security, that she had already lived with the consequences of giving too much and losing everything, and the pain in her words struck him harder than any accusation, because he saw her past repeating itself through him, the same pattern of sacrifice and hope that had led her here, and for the first time doubt took root, whispering that maybe compassion was a luxury he could not afford, that maybe the world was right to demand boundaries where hearts wanted bridges. The conflict came to a head when Daniel was forced to make an impossible choice after Emma fell ill and medical expenses piled up alongside a notice threatening eviction, the numbers unforgiving, the margin for error gone, and at the same time Margaret faced the loss of her temporary shelter placement due to overcrowding, her options narrowing to the streets once more, and Daniel stood at the center of these converging crises feeling torn in half, his instinct screaming to shield both the child he loved and the woman he could not abandon, knowing that any decision would cost him something irretrievable, and as he argued with agencies, begged for extensions, and worked extra shifts that left him barely upright, the strain manifested in moments of sharpness he regretted immediately, snapping at Emma over small things, falling silent with Margaret when words failed him, the bond between them tested not by lack of care but by the brutal reality that care alone could not solve everything, whispers reached him. Through acquaintances that helping her was foolish, that people like Margaret would only drag him down, that there was a difference between kindness and self-destruction, and Daniel found himself questioning definitions he had once believed were simple, wondering whether wealth was measured by what you could keep or what you were willing to give away, whether poverty began with empty pockets or with empty regard for others. And as the tension built toward a breaking point, Margaret made a decision of her own, quietly packing her few belongings and leaving a note thanking him for restoring her faith in humanity, apologizing for becoming a burden, and telling him that some kindnesses were meant to be brief so they could be remembered without regret. And when Daniel found the note, panic surged through him like ice water. The realization that losing her would mean losing a part of himself he had only just rediscovered, and as he rushed out into the cold, bills unpaid, responsibilities screaming for attention, he understood with terrifying clarity that compassion was no longer an abstract virtue but a choice demanding everything. And standing there at the edge of collapse, with his job, his home, and his fragile stability hanging in the balance, Daniel faced the moment that would decide whether kindness could survive in a harsh world, or whether this was where it finally broke. Daniel found Margaret just before dawn, sitting on a bench near the river where the city grew quieter and the holiday lights thinned into reflections on dark water, her small suitcase at her feet and her hands folded neatly in her lap as if she were waiting for permission to exist. And when she looked up and saw him, relief and sorrow crossed her face in equal measure, because she had hoped he would come and feared what it would mean if he did. And in that fragile moment neither of them spoke, the cold air carrying the weight of everything they had not yet said, until Daniel finally sat beside her, his voice unsteady but resolved as he told her that leaving would not make things easier for him, that pretending this bond had been temporary would be a lie neither of them deserved, and that compassion, he had learned, was not about saving someone but about refusing to abandon them when the cost became real. And Margaret listened with tears she did not wipe away, because she had spent too long believing she had to disappear quietly to be worthy of love. What followed was not a miracle in the way stories often promise, no sudden wealth, no sweeping rescues, but a series of small, stubborn choices that leaned toward dignity instead of despair, beginning with Daniel swallowing his pride and asking for help, reaching out to a community center his late wife once volunteered at, explaining Margaret's situation without embellishment or shame, and finding, to his surprise, not judgment but recognition, people who remembered Margaret as a teacher, who remembered her kindness, who remembered being seen by her when they were young and unsure, and those memories opened doors no argument ever could, leading to temporary housing arranged not out of pity but respect, to donated furniture that arrived with handwritten notes, to Emma meeting Margaret properly for the first time and offering her a drawing with shy seriousness, saying simply, "My dad says you like books," and Margaret holding that drawing as if it were something sacred. The ripple spread quietly from there, touching Daniel's life too in ways he had not anticipated, his supervisor softening after learning the truth rather than the rumor, offering flexible hours instead of warnings, his landlord agreeing to delay the rent increase after a neighbor intervened without being asked, small mercies accumulating not because the world had changed, but because people, when given the chance to see clearly, sometimes chose kindness over convenience. And through it all Margaret insisted on contributing what she could, tutoring children at the center, organizing donated books, reclaiming pieces of her identity that had been buried beneath survival, her posture straightening not because her life was suddenly easy, but because she was no longer invisible. Daniel watched this transformation with quiet awe, realizing that what he had given her was not rescue but recognition, and what she had given him in return was equally profound, a reminder that worth did not end where usefulness did, that being strong did not mean being alone, and that Emma was watching everything, learning lessons no lecture could teach, seeing compassion practiced rather than preached. And as winter slowly loosened its grip on the city, there came a day when Margaret stood in her small, sunlit room, books lining the shelves once more, and told Daniel that she felt at peace for the first time in years, not because her losses had been erased, but because they had been witnessed. And Daniel felt a quiet release inside himself too, the constant fear of falling easing as he understood that stability was not the absence of risk but the presence of connection. The true miracle revealed itself not in a single moment but in reflection, in the way Daniel began to see the world differently, noticing the elderly man at the bus stop, the tired cashier, the single mother juggling bags and patience, and understanding that richness had nothing to do with what you accumulated and everything to do with what you were willing to notice and nurture. And on a spring evening not unlike the winter night that had started it all, Daniel, Margaret, and Emma walked by the river again, the water calmer now, the lights softer, Margaret moving more slowly but with confidence, Emma chattering between them, and Daniel felt something settle gently into place, a sense that though the world remained imperfect and often cruel, it was also quietly stitched together by people who chose, again and again, to care. And as Margaret reached for his hand, not in need, But in gratitude, Daniel understood that compassion had not cost him everything, as he once feared, but had given him something enduring, a deeper humanity, a shared purpose, and the unshakable knowledge that even in a broken world, small acts of kindness could still lift souls, including his own.